All right, the Houthis just rolled out this video that they call Operation Destructive Flood. It's a military exercise they carried out in Yemen against a series of mock U.S., Israeli, and British targets. So we're going to take a look at this thing and see what we can take away from it. So starting out, drones underground. There's a lot of underground movement in this video that I think is interesting. But they're launching these drones. They're going to drop munitions on targets in the base here in a second. Not the craziest thing to have these pre-positioned, and what you're going to see later is this entire area that they're carrying out this attack is prepared. So this is not some hasty attack. This is attacking an area where the Houthis have dug in, have defensive positions, earthworks, underground tunnels ready to go. So we'll see. Now this is the mock Israeli village of sorts. Of course, Israeli flags and everything. One thing to note right out the gate here, and we're going to see it throughout, is they likely have some sort of... That was a normal drone explosion. That is not a normal explosion. Let's see which one. Not normal. Okay. That much of a fireball, that much burning right out the gate is not what you'd expect from a drone drop munition. So it looks like in a lot of these cases, they have something inside of these targets, some sort of fuel or explosive, something to make the boom a little bit bigger. And we'll actually kind of see that. There's another one. That's not a normal reaction to a grenade dropping on top of it, whatever it might be. And we're going to see that throughout the rest of this video. You'll see a lot of these. It's kind of Hollywood effects, if you will. It doesn't take away from the accuracy or what they're hitting with these munitions, but thought that was interesting. So they do highlight a handful of their drones here. They go back to this one a couple times, showing kind of reconnaissance style drones, and then they shift over to indirect fire. Same thing here. Again, everything's coming out of the ground, so you don't want to write this off entirely. They kind of present this like it's an offensive operation. Of course, it couldn't really be with this sort of underground. I mean, it's perfectly in range, right? It's like they get to carry out an offensive operation exactly where they dug these firing points for their mortars. That's not likely. But in terms of something defensive or setting this up in certain areas where an enemy force might be advancing through, it's a different story. It kind of shows what they might be trying to put together. So we've got the indirect fire aspect here. They kind of walk through this and how they lay out this operation, saying it starts with drones, then it moves to mortars and artillery. They referenced artillery firing on this firing point, enemy firing point. You can see the howitzers laid out there. I didn't see any Houthi artillery being used. And again, they referenced mortars specifically and artillery. Clearly the mortars are underground. That's an interesting view there, isn't it? From the side where you can't see anything underground and the mortars keep popping out left and right. Pretty accurate fire, all things considered, and they do a good job in a pre-registered, right? They would have had this sighted in. It's not dynamic targeting, so you got to consider all of that. But something to think about when it's going to be in a lot of this video is the massing of fires. So there's a lot of explosions on this mock firing point here. The entire thing is going up in smoke. And if you had, say, 10 81 millimeter mortars laid out, which they have more than that, if you're putting at the minimum 50 rounds a minute through those things, a more experienced crew can get quite a bit more than that. You're talking about 50 rounds in the span of 1 minute, almost 1 round per second impacting on that firing point. That's a lot of death and destruction. So the Houthis' ability, from what we can see here, to be able to kind of mass fires and have that many systems and that much ammunition to use is, that could cause a lot of damage. So we're back over to the village here. Not entirely clear what this is trying to show. It's not, clear that anytime soon the Houthis would be engaged in ground combat with Israeli forces. But another move here, popping out of the underground tunnels. This one looks very much just kind of staged, if you will. They're kind of role-playing throughout this exercise, I would say. But they have these snipers, and they say they're targeting security cameras and kind of the exterior of some of these fortified walls. So again, you're going to see some of these things. Look, that's not what you expect from a round impacting the building, a fireball kicking out. So again, some sort of pyrotechnics added there. to enhance what we're actually seeing. And I believe this is when we move into the more tunnels popping up all across the front. Here we go, the RPG gunners. Now, we're definitely seeing a curated view of all of this, right? I mean, it bounces around from one clip to the next. It seems pretty continuous, but they're definitely highlighting the impacts and the hits. But look, if you watch these RPG gunners, it seems like they're hitting their target pretty consistently, time and time and time again. Now, the targets are relatively big, these standalone structures. The Houthis are not on the receiving end of any fire, so there's a lot of things to consider here. Heart rate's probably not beating through the roof because you're in the middle of a combat situation, but they do seem to be pretty accurate, all things considered, when firing these RPGs. So again, stepping back a second, we had the drones impacting some of the outer defenses, then the artillery and the mortars trying to suppress the enemy artillery systems, and now we've got the RPG gunners and snipers directly engaging this mock village or town. Before long, we're going to start to see some maneuver elements kick up and try to assault into this village. So again, back through the tunnels here. Look, those have been there for a minute. Again, talking to this whole idea of, is this an offensive or defensive operation? This reminds me a little bit of what we would see in portions of the Vietnam War, right, where the U.S. would go out conducting these movement contact type missions, and they'd end up in an area. The Battle of LZ X-Ray is a great example. The book We Were Soldiers Once and Young was based on that. The movie We Were Soldiers, where American forces were on the offensive, and they just happened into an area where there was an entire NVA regiment, I believe, kind of based in the mountain. So they kind of stumbled inadvertently into an area that the NVA had dug these tunnels to protect themselves from American bombardment. That's kind of what comes to mind when I see this. Like the Americans, the Israelis, or the British show up in an area and just happen to set up camp where all of these tunnels are located. So then it turns over to these motorcycle RPG gunners, and they're firing these things from the back of the motorcycles, which is a serious feat. Even firing that thing and staying on the bike is impressive. That one, we didn't clearly see what they were able to impact. But, we're starting to transition. Well, we've kind of been there the whole time. When you have to think of what they might be fighting, who they might be fighting when looking at some of these tactics. So a singular motorcycle riding through the desert with an RPG gunner on the back is easy pickings for just about any platform that the United States, air platform that the United States, Israel, or the British have in their arsenal. BMP's coming out. We're going to come back to that here in a second. So some armored vehicles, the Houthis clearly have these. They have for a while. Don't see them a lot outside of training videos. But as they continue this kind of assault phase, and this will be good to talk through some of these other things, they're moving that infantry directly on scene here. And I believe there's also some that pop out from the tunnels and kind of join in this fight. But I don't know if you noticed, that BMP came out of the ground. All right, so everything is underground here, which I guess makes sense. Here we go, more infantry coming out to storm this village. If you're looking at this terrain, there's only so many places you're going to be able to hide. It's not a jungle, right? It's not a dense urban environment. This one isn't. So I guess underground is the place to go. So to go back to, as they move through this village, there's a couple things to highlight. Again, think of who they would be fighting with this. What you're seeing with this force is it's not a completely amateur element. There's aspects of what they're doing that has hints of a professional military. It's coordinated. There's a degree of muzzle discipline as they're moving through this village. Seems to be a fair amount of communication and coordination. You look at this and say, well, it's an exercise. It's planning. It's coordinated and set up to happen like this beforehand. Even then, it still takes the execution by the soldiers, and you can't take a batch of very poorly trained new soldiers and carry out even a training exercise like this without a lot of things going wrong. So I wouldn't write the Houthis off entirely by looking at this. This is not what you would expect, again, from the U.S. military conducting a similar drill. But it's a pretty significant step up from some of these militias and terrorist organizations that we're so used to engaging across the Middle East. We've got some role players here. I'm optimistic, hopeful those role players weren't in there when there were RPGs raining down from 3 different directions. But who knows? Doesn't look like those. I mean, they're still firing small arms through this tent. Those guys are, I don't know. Hopefully they weren't there. Caught in the crossfire. Got to get the Israeli flag down. There you go. Throw that thing on the ground. They also, here in a minute, we got a guy going down. Pretend going down. This is training exercise, YouTube. Nobody's actually being shot, killed, or wounded in this video. And they're practicing a medevac as well. So there is a degree of professionalism that we're seeing here. I think it's easy to look at what the Houthis are doing and have done over a period of time and brush them off and say it's nothing. It's an amateur force. And again, to bring it back to what I was talking about, the motorcycle gunners a second ago, that is a very easy target for just about every system in the U.S. arsenal, whether it's overhead or on the ground. I mean, a 240 gunner with no optics is going to have a field day with that motorcycle trying to get away after launching the RPG. That's not necessarily who I would look at in terms of an adversary that the Houthis are going to fight on the ground. This is probably, there's no reason the Houthis would try to engage the U.S. military in this manner. Most likely, it would be other similar-sized militaries, similar capable forces, possibly in the Middle East. Again, this also looks an awful lot like a defensive-type battle, something to consider. Maybe their preparations for trying to defend their territory if they think, you know, somebody like the United States, the UK, or Israel is going to end up in Yemen trying to force some sort of regime change. Now I'm going to move the clip forward a little bit. What happens here is it's kind of a lot of just footage showing these guys running around the mountaintops. We got the Americans here. They're going to kill off the mountaintop, but this is not all that interesting compared to the next clip where what they outline in their statements is that this is, here we go. They present this as a convoy coming in to try to rescue the besieged village, and they're going to attack this convoy. And you can see pretty standard tactic here. This was something that the Soviets did very, very effectively. The Mujahideen did very, very effectively against the Soviets in Afghanistan. They're targeting, looks like massive IEDs. The front, and wow, that tunnel is right next to the blast site. Massive IEDs at the start and the end of the column. The Mujahideen would usually use RPGs or some sort of charge, again, to try to kind of box that column in. And some of the roads in Afghanistan, there's no clear way to move around that. This is a little bit different, of course, pretty open terrain. These elements could maneuver left and right to get around. But you box that force in, and then you see the infantry move in and start to assault downhill, if you will, into this column, killing and capturing anyone that remains. So a piece I wanted to call out here is just kind of the scenario planning. This is interesting. The things that the Houthis are thinking through and planning for when it comes to conducting these military operations. It's not just shooting at targets. It's not just firing artillery, but they're playing out these whole scenarios that, you know, make sense to a degree, right? If there's an outpost that is attacked by the Houthis, and then it gets overrun or even takes a handful of casualties, it's likely you're going to have some sort of relief column coming in. That relief column is probably pretty heavily armed, probably has an air escort, and is not just a handful of like 2-ton type trucks that we see in this one here. But nonetheless, this does kind of speak to what could play out on the ground, and the Houthis are preparing for that here. So again, when looking through, there we go, got an American. The Americans have the American, got to stomp on it. Got it. Oh, I think he shot that American flag. Yes, he is. Okay. So again, pretty interesting clip here released by the Houthis. I'll link in the description below to the original source if you want to go check it out in its entirety. But I do think there's some key takeaways here. The Houthis are clearly planning for kind of complex type operations, if you will. Again, this is a lot more than just, you know, launch some mortars, launch some drones, whatever it might be. This is, to a degree, combined arms warfare. Or I shouldn't say that. For the Houthis' capabilities, what they have at their disposal, this is combined arms warfare. Now, how that plays out in, you know, an actual hot war is a different story. Here we go. We got the guys, more tunnels right next to the column there. And there you go. So you see when it hits, how it's like these big secondary explosions. There's some sort of pyrotechnics involved there. But these tunnels right next to the column goes back to what we were talking about earlier, kind of the defensive nature of this, but how it's also not, look, those are pretty effective, pretty accurate RPG shots. It's also not that crazy. It gives us an idea of what the Houthis are thinking about when looking at combat situations in their country. pre-planning positions like this. Again, this is something that that I want to say Afghans, Mujahideen by and large, and then the Taliban ended up doing pretty effectively in Afghanistan, building out defensive structures well ahead of time, and then as needed, they were able to pop into. I mean, we dealt with bunkers, significant bunkers in southern Afghanistan. You didn't know they were there. Then all of a sudden you start taking fire from the south. You can't figure out what it is, and there's an entire bunker network underground that they hadn't used in a few months, and now is the right time, so they moved in, occupied, and began engaging our forces. It makes sense that the Houthis would try to do something similar. So again, full video here. Well, this is about the end of it. You're going to see the video, the vehicle smoking for a while here, open up with some small arms, and they're going to assault through to take any prisoners that might remain. But yeah, we'll put this in the description below. I thought it was worth running through. Again, I think it's very easy to underestimate any adversary. I think that's dangerous. There's plenty that they're doing here that probably would not be effective against the U.S. forces, even a small U.S. element. But there's other aspects here that in the right time, in the right place, under the right circumstances would be deadly. So I think it's worth watching, paying attention, and kind of absorbing anything that groups, especially like the Houthis, when they're out there chanting death to America, put out to get a better idea of what kind of situations they're training for. But that's all I got for now. Of course, if you're interested in this or other national security subjects, check out the Substack, linked in the description below. That is going to be linked alongside the original video here of the Houthis conducting destructive flood, this military operation they just carried out in Yemen. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.